So yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. I'm William Stewart, and I'm a health and wellbeing advisor at a company called Ekkist. I'm here today to talk to you about the rise of health and wellbeing within the real estate industry and how you can go about incorporating health and wellbeing within your business models. So firstly, a little bit about Ekkist. So we're the UK's first health and wellbeing consultancy in the UK. When it comes to the advice we give, number one, it's always strategic, so it always fits in with an organisation's long-term goals. Secondly, it's always evidence-based, so absolutely everything we advise is backed up by scientific and academic research. And finally, it's always value-driven. So the first point of value we're looking to achieve is an element of social value. So we are looking to improve people's health in the built environment, but from our studies and from other research, there is a knock-on effect in value in terms of a financial benefit value, which I'll touch on a bit later on. We do a huge amount of voluntary work at Ekkist. So my colleague Ben is an expert in how the built environment affects people's mental health, and he's written the two books here in the bottom left-hand corner. I myself, and my background, so I'm an RICS chartered surveyor and background in sort of development and asset management. So I do a huge amount of work with the RICS, including the document on the bottom right, which is the design, delivery and management of healthy buildings, which is a document which came out towards the end of last year. It's sort of like a one-stop shop document for project management people, asset managers, to sort of get an idea of what it is to create a healthy building. And then the final one I mentioned on this page is we do a huge amount of work as well with the Well Building Institute. So they run the Well Building Certification Standard, which is the leading standard for creating healthy buildings around the world. So for this presentation, firstly I'll look at why it's important we should be creating a healthy built environment, and then I'll sort of run you through what are some of the key aspects of a healthy built environment, and then finally we'll come into some of the business models and some examples. Throughout the presentation, I'll sort of focus mainly on sort of residential and office spaces in terms of some of the stats, but what I'm talking about is pretty much applicable across all use classes of real estate. So first of all, so our individual health is directly tied to the health of our buildings, and this quote really underpins what myself and what Ekkist were all about. And the main reason is because research has consistently showed that the environments where we spend our time actually have a greater impact on our health than our genetics. So it's vitally important we're making sure these places are healthy for us. However, unfortunately, a lot of our built environment is not up to that standard at the moment. And I put a couple of stats on the screen which just link back to this, but there are hundreds of other stats we could have chosen. So currently you can see that 1 in 3 Europeans are currently exposed to some form of indoor climatic hazard. That could be things like damp, mold, darkness, excessive noise. And if you've lived in a house or an apartment which has any of those issues, I'm sure you'll be able to sort of comprehend the kind of effect they can possibly have on your health and your mental health. 50 million Europeans are currently living in energy poverty, and this means that they are unable to sufficiently heat their homes to a sufficient standard. And this has obviously been compounded as well with the cost of living crisis in recent years. And then the one at the bottom is a bit more Great Britain focused, but we've got 7.4 million across Great Britain have said that their well-being was affected in the last 7 days as a result of feeling lonely. Loneliness is not just something which affects people's mental health, but it also has a big impact on physical health as well. So what are the key aspects to consider when we're looking at healthy buildings? This is a diagram here we put together for the RICS, so you can see in the center we've got building for health, and then around the outside we've got all the key aspects of what create a healthy building. It's important when looking at healthy buildings that we're creating, or that we're taking a holistic and balanced approach. So we're taking all of these points into consideration. So you've got things around the edge there like sound, water quality, building management, air quality, and food provision, for example, on site. I'm going to go into a couple of these in a bit more detail, just to give you a bit of background about it. So first of all, air quality. As Europeans, we spend approximately 90% of our time indoors, and we breathe around about 15,000 litres of air every single day. Unfortunately, the World Health Organization has said that 99% of the global population, so almost the whole population, is breathing air which is in excess of what they consider to be sort of like healthy air. It's above their limits. The long-run effects of breathing in poor quality air is it can obviously have cardiovascular problems. So we're looking at things that can go wrong with our heart and with our lungs and certain types of diseases. But when we're looking inside the built environment then, so what are the potential contaminants? So firstly, if you're in your own home or in your office, for example, the potential contaminants can come from a number of different sources that can reduce the quality of your air. So they could come from outside, first of all. If you're living in a city centre with lots of idling traffic outside, you could get sort of like fumes coming in from the pollution. But it could be things also from within your home, like stoves, candles. Certain building materials can also off-gas contaminants in the air, which have been proven to be bad for us as well. And also, it can also come from our cells. So if you look at the example of having a number of people within a small meeting room, and that meeting room is not properly ventilated, you can get a large buildup of CO2. And within that space, scientific studies have proved that with high levels of CO2, you get an 11% reduction in productivity, you get impaired cognitive function, and you get poor decision making as well. So the examples I've put in terms of some of the ways to work around this are quite sort of like extravagant examples, but I'll give some more ones that are a bit more applicable. But this one on the screen here is the liquid tree in Belgrade, which you may have heard about. So Belgrade is one of the most polluted cities in Europe. But this liquid tree is a tank basically full of algae which photosynthesizes at sort of like a hyper-efficient rate. So this tank here can photosynthesize at the rate of 2 10-year-old trees. But obviously, there's, when you're looking at your own homes or workplaces, we're looking at sort of like beginning to monitor the air quality. We're looking at our material specification and making sure that we're not putting any materials in there which are going to off-gas any nasty contaminants. And we're also looking at the possibility of pollution capturing plants. It depends how far you want to go with that. There's a man in India called Kamal Mittal who has taken it really far, and in fact his office space, I think it's about 3 floors of a building in Delhi, is now the cleanest air in Delhi, and he's done that by using plants and an airflow system to sort of circulate the air around his office. And then obviously we're also looking at mechanical ventilation systems and filtration systems. So lighting. There's 2 key aspects to lighting. The first one to consider is daylight. So when our skin is exposed to sunlight, we use cholesterol in our body, which then produces vitamin D. Without vitamin D, we get problems coming up with our bones, our teeth. We also get problems like fatigue and potential for high likelihood of things like depression as well. So it's absolutely vital that when we're creating places, we're making sure we have good access to outdoor quality space. The example here is a build-to-rent scheme in Manchester where they've used roof lights to bring light into the basement. But you could also be looking at dual aspect homes, winter gardens, or when we're looking at offices, we're looking, if possible, to try and have shallow floor plates to make sure that we can get as many people sat as close to the windows as possible. Or if you have got a large floor plate, you're looking at kind of taking that extra step in how you plan that place. So if you're going to have, for example, the meeting rooms and the kitchens towards the centre, which are rooms which don't get used that often, you can then make sure that people are sat around the edges within the window space. When it comes to electronic lighting, the 2 key aspects there is it's important we make sure it is low flicker and also anti-glare as well. And basically that's all kind of like, the other important aspect of that is making sure that the lighting is fit for the task you are doing within that space. If that's not the case, then you can get things like fatigue and eye strain and headaches as well. And the stats on the screen support this. So children with access to brighter daylit classrooms had higher test results, and then employees as well who moved from a poorly lit space to a well-lit space had an overall perceived improvement in their performance. When moving on to acoustics, so noise is much more than just an irritant. In fact, the World Health Organization has listed it as one of their key environmental health conditions. So basically, noise disturbances cause stresses on our body, and it all affects what's called our autonomic nervous system. And this results in the release of a stress hormone, which is called cortisol. If your body is regularly releasing cortisol, it damages the lining of your blood vessels and increases the risk of cardiovascular events such as stroke or heart attack. It also causes things like sleep disturbances, hypertension as well, and there was a study which came out not too long ago in Chicago, which showed it also had links to causing Alzheimer's in later life. The example here we have, this is a sound barrier in South London, and it's basically blocking the sound of the really noisy road with the buildings opposite, but I quite like it as an example because the council have used it as an opportunity to kind of like bring in a piece of artwork and a point of interest for the local community as well. But within our buildings, we're looking at acoustic panels and baffles. We're looking at noise-absorbing materials as well, or less sort of more cost-effective options as well is more about zone planning. So if we've got a large office space, we're looking at kind of like grouping together quiet zones and loud zones, for example. And again, like sound masking is another option. And if we're working on larger schemes, it's important to look to make sure there is an acoustician involved and that their input is taken into the design. So materials, this is one area that particularly interests me. So newly installed materials on a project, whether it be sort of like soft furnishings, carpets, but in particular we're looking at things which are wet applied products, so things like paints, glues, adhesives. These are likely to give off what's called volatile organic compounds, so they off-gas these compounds into the air. The problem there is that many of these compounds are not good for us. We've got things like formaldehyde and benzene. If we breathe those in, it's not good for us, and they've been linked to being carcinogenic. So it's important we're using as much as possible natural materials, or as well certified healthy materials, and this is becoming much more of sort of like a big area, and there's lots of certifications out there in terms of materials. This one, for example, is quite an interesting one. So these are Mogu acoustic panels. So they're very good acoustic panels. They're also sort of health certified, and they're actually made from something called mycelium. So it's the roots of mushrooms is what they've been constructed out of. Biophilic design. So if you haven't come across the term biophilic design before, it's all about basically creating a greater link from us in the built environment with the natural world. And scientific studies have pretty much conclusively proven the benefits for our health in terms of reductions in, there's been studies on depression, studies on anxiety, studies on the benefits to our nervous system. So basically what we're looking to do here is making sure that we're trying to incorporate the natural world within our built environment. The example on the screen is Maggie's in Leeds, which is actually not too far from where I grew up. And this is a hospital in Leeds. And you can see Heatherwick Studios with the architects, and they've gone really far with including biophilic design within the space. You can see natural wood materials throughout, including the plants as well, and natural forms. And you can't see, but through that window, you then look out onto natural gardens as well and green space. There's been a lot of studies in particular on views of nature. So, for example, they've done a study on school children who were doing the same test, and they found that children performed better when they had a view of nature when compared to a barren view. And similarly, people who were recovering in hospital from heart surgery, they recovered 10% faster when they had a view of nature when compared to a barren view like a car park or a concrete building or something like that. Moving on to social interactions and linking back to that loneliness point, and this was a statistic that came out towards the end of last year. So the effects of chronic loneliness have a huge effect on our mortality, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. So if someone is chronically lonely, their mortality increases by up to 26%. They're more likely to experience cognitive decline, more likely to experience depression, and a higher risk of heart disease. But we believe that, as we do with all of these points, that as property professionals, we can sort of like help in this situation and do what we can do within the built environment to improve this. This is quite a nice example which I like, which is the Parklet bench in London. A very small space, part of the streetscape, where the architect has used the space to create a bench which promotes play and promotes people to converse with each other on a daily basis. But there's lots of other ways of doing this. We work with quite a few developers who are now incorporating much more community space and public spaces within their schemes. But we also recommend things like Library of Things, time banking schemes also are very popular. But it could also be something as simple as just a notice board within buildings. Little things like that can actually have quite a big effect on sort of like building community where people can put adverts up or advertise running clubs, etc., etc. One thing we're quite big on at Ekkist as well is we do a lot of work reviewing housing schemes, and quite often I feel like some of the housing in the UK, we sort of, it'll be a 2-bedroom house and there'll be a breakfast bar for 2. So there's not space there to kind of have people around to your house for a meal. We always say that, for example, if it's a 2-bed house, there should be a dining table with 4 chairs around it, so you can have those social spaces, or else, you're going to struggle really to have people over. So coming on to the business case, we've talked about sort of the social points, but in terms of where we've seen some financial benefits. And the first one here is obviously UK-based, but it's quite a shocking statistic which came out by the BRE, who are the organisation behind BREEAM. So poor quality homes in England cost the NHS £1.4 billion per year. So that's a direct result of homes having an impact on people's lives and they're having to go to the doctor and get certain treatments. But then there is that kind of multiplier effect on the economy, where it has a wider effect on society of people missing, days of work, school, education, whatever it may be, of £18.6 billion per year. But there is definitely as well a consumer shift here. So you can see that people have started doing studies and 30% of homeowners are willing to pay more for a home that they knew would have a positive effect on their well-being. And similarly, in offices, we're noticing that financial benefit. So this was a study done by the WDBE, the International Well Buildings Institute, and they found overall that buildings which had a health certification were easier to lease, they commanded higher rents per square foot, and they also were better at attracting and retaining tenants for the long term. So how do we go about implementing all this within business models? So for us, the best way to do it is all organizations now should be putting together or should already have an overall ESG strategy. And obviously health and well-being falls within the S because it's a social point. And on the next slide, we've got a bit of a roadmap that we pretty much believe that all organizations can follow the general critical path of that roadmap, but obviously sort of like the outcomes and the sort of general journey will be different. So, looking at that roadmap. So the first point there is to look to appoint a health and well-being lead within your organization. So ideally, this person should be on the strategic team of that organization, or they should at least have access regularly to that strategic team. The second point, or second 2 points, are all about sort of putting together those strategic goals in terms of health and well-being, and what do you and your organization want to achieve. Moving on to the next 2 points, it's about putting those into play. So you've got your overall strategic goals at the top, and then beneath that you'll have your sort of action points that will enable you to start chipping away to start achieving your goals. So for example, it's about starting to feed in those action points into your design briefs, into your operational teams, and making sure that they are sort of being implemented and your teams are being trained in terms of how they're going to go about achieving it. And then moving on to points 4 and 5, it's all about actioning your strategy, as I've said. So yeah, making sure that all the relevant teams are aware of exactly what they need to do. And then it's about reviewing and monitoring. So making sure that you're on track and you're keeping constant track of where you are on your strategy and how you're getting there. That's those last 2 points. And then finally we come on to a point here which we always recommend, which is about that final extra point of monitoring, is about post-occupancy and seeing how well people on the ground are responding to the strategy and how well it's going. And then whatever you can do, feeding back in those lessons learned. So in terms of the business models, a lot of organizations are now moving towards certifications, and certifications in my area of health and well-being is a massive growth area. So for example, a lot of organizations that we work with are starting to say, as part of their strategy, they want new developments they're working on moving forward to achieve a certain level of certification. So I will touch on some of the key certifications that are coming forward within this industry. So we've put together this diagram here, and you can see it goes all the way from corporate scale certifications. So these are predominantly for your funds or your large corporate bodies who will have a number of properties, and they'll be able to register pretty much a whole portfolio and see how well that portfolio is performing. And then we move down to sort of master plan scale certifications. These are, because certifications are still quite new, and obviously master plans take a long time to come together, these are, we haven't seen many of these coming through yet, but there are a couple coming through. And then now we're on to building certifications, and some of these terms I'm sure you will have come across. So you can see some of the 2 major ones there we've got are the Well Building Standard and the Fitwell Standard. And across this board, the size of the circle is significant. So the larger the circle means how much it links to health and well-being. So for example, the ones which are entitled well solely focuses on health and well-being, whereas if you look at something like BREEAM in that column there, BREEAM is actually more of an overall sustainability certification, but there are some features within BREEAM which are linked to health and well-being, hence why it's a smaller circle. And then moving down into the very far end column, we've got discipline-specific certifications, and basically within that column, we're looking at things like individual ones to do with products. And you might have come across AirScore, so if you're buying, say, a washing machine or some flooring or certain things like that, sometimes they might have that stamp on it, which means that it's acoustically good in terms of health. And then, as I say, a lot of the ones to do with materials as well, which is a big area. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to focus on the two major health and well-being certifications, which are the WELL Standard and the Fitwel Standard. So the WELL Standard is the world-leading certification for health and well-being at the moment. It is very all-encompassing, so you can see we've got these 10 concepts across the bottom, so it covers a lot of the things I've sort of already covered this morning, but it's air, water, nourishment, light. Everything in the WELL Standard is backed up by scientific and academic research. And one of the reasons WELL is classed as so robust and so sort of world-renowned is that within all of these 10 concepts, there are mandatory preconditions. So if you do not meet, say if you're developing an office building or something like that, or you're applying for it on an office or something, if it doesn't meet those mandatories, you will not receive WELL. It's really, really straightforward. If you are meeting those mandatory requirements, you can then go further forward and go for optimization points, and the more optimization points are, the higher you are on the scale. So it'll either be bronze, silver, gold, or platinum. Again, with WELL, it's just relating back to its sort of robustness. Once you finish the certification, someone will come out from WELL and they will come and test the space. They will take water samples, they will check light levels, they will test the acoustics, they will really do a thorough check on your building. So you know that if you walk into a WELL Platinum building, it is an exceptionally healthy space. One thing to note as well is that it's maybe sort of like a 60-40 split with WELL, so 60-40 in terms of 60% is to do with sort of like the design of the building, so that covers everything from what the architect does, the landscape team, the M&E team, but then 40% is probably around about things which are to do with operations and running the building. Fitwel is another health and well-being certification, very similar to WELL in the terms of that it's also backed up by scientific and academic research. Again, similar to WELL, they have a slightly different scoring standard, 1-star, 2-star, and 3-star. Fitwel is not regarded as robust as WELL in the market, and that is mainly because it doesn't have those mandatory preconditions. So as a building owner, you can sort of pick a little bit more in terms of the concepts which you choose. So just looking at the growth of these certifications, so you can see on the map here, it's color-coded, so the darker the area, that is, and the figures relate to total WELL and total Fitwel certified buildings. So you can see in America there, we've got 20,000 buildings, which is doing really, really well, but you can see we have got quite a few in Europe. The UAE has got a lot, same with China and Australia. But if you think overall, the WELL standard was it's traditionally an American standard, but it only has been going since 2014, so this is within 10 years that buildings have gone through, been built and been certified, and similarly with Fitwel, it's only been since 2016, so it's really ramping up pace, and I can see it just getting stronger and stronger. For a lot of organizations, certifications aren't for them, so we do a lot of work with our individual frameworks, just to sort of now talk about a couple of example projects. So we do a lot of work. At the moment, one big growth area, particularly in the UK, is later living. There's a huge amount of investment going into later living real estate. So we're reviewing a design guide for a later living company who basically kind of like are developing maybe 5 or 6 different later living, and we'll go through and review that against health and well-being criteria. And we do the same as well for some social housing operators as well, or social housing developers, sorry. So moving on to a couple of examples. We do a lot of work with an organization called Quintain, which some of you may have heard of, but Quintain own a lot of the land around Wembley Stadium in London. And they're developed, so we've worked a lot on their overall health and well-being strategy, and also in terms of a lot of their build-to-rent product as well. This is quite an interesting example, which is still in the very early stages. This is the Crichton Trust. I've tried to give a real kind of broad array of different projects, but this is the Crichton Trust in Scotland. We actually won this as part of a competition with the architects, O'Donnell Brown, and it's still kind of in design at the minute, but hopefully we'll start moving on the next few years. But we're looking forward to sort of hopefully bringing in some really interesting materials on this one in particular, using things like rammed earth and earth walls, and really making use of natural materials and Scottish building methods as well. This is quite an old example, but this is a co-living scheme in London. This is an area, again, of huge growth in the UK. It was actually an old biscuit factory which has been converted into co-living, and it took on a huge number of the principles of WELL certification within its design and operation. In fact, they really did push the operational side of things on this building to make it a really kind of healthy, in that sense, in terms of building a community, a social community. And we've seen some excellent post-occupancy research from this building, in that one lady even said that lifelong eczema had reduced since she had moved into this building. We do a huge amount of work with Landsec as well. So Landsec are the largest commercial real estate owner in the UK. So we do a lot of work on their residential strategy, but I'll just flick on to the next one, which is a project which we very recently finished, which is New Street Square for them. So Landsec have got a flexible office business as well called Mayo, so we do a huge amount of work with them, and this office recently received WELL Platinum. So if you're achieving WELL Platinum, you're basically doing really well across all of those health concepts. And you can see from the image, in terms of the natural materials, the architect, DMFK have pushed really hard to include within the space, from the planting to the natural wood to the stone. Even the carpet is natural sisal grasses. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed.